I remember the bridge at Cawood and the bridge at Selby on my way to the clinic, for which I was never early, which will not surprise many people. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk about John Burton. The title that I was working towards was The Extraordinary Life and Times of Tristan Shandy's Real Mad Midwife, John Burton, MD. That was suggested by our more literary president, who has now gone off to India to avoid hearing my attempt to portray a literary genius badly. Burton was known as Dr. Slop in literature. He's one of the 10 most infamous doctors in literature, and I didn't think the title was one that he merited. I thought that York's Most Infamous Obstetrician would be better. Unfortunately, I thought that it might be confused with some others. And with 2 in the room from York and 2 others from points elsewhere, it's probably wrong to use that title. So I was going to stick to the life and times of John Burton, MD. Physician, obstetrician, political activist, prisoner of the Crown, philanthropist, antiquarian, chronicler and apologist. And now you've heard it all. I'm going to tell you something about his education, his politics, his philanthropy, his medical writing, something about 19th century peer review. It happened then and it happens now. Antiquarian writing, collisions with others, and that means really colliding with others, and an opportunity to see some 18th century art. There is a Chinese proverb, may you live in interesting times. It's apocryphal because it was coined in the 1930s by the British ambassador to China, but people have embellished that with, may you come to the attention of those in authority, may you come to the attention of powerful people, and may you come to the attention of important people. And I'm going to bring John Burton to the important people in this room tonight. He was born in Colchester in 1710. He was the eldest surviving son of John Burton, very good on names in the family. His son was called John as well. And Margaret née Leake, whose father and the maternal grandfather of John Burton was the vicar of Kirkthorpe near Wakefield. His brother Christopher, his younger brother, was ordained and became vicar of Cherry Burton and died there in 1741. He had 2 younger sisters who both were buried with their mother in infancy, and their mother obviously died of something nasty in 1713, so he was a half an orphan. His father retired to Heath near Kirkthorpe in 1723, and suggests in a way that he was probably an older man to retire at that age, just when Burton was in his teens. We know that he was educated for a year at the Merchant Taylors' School in London, which in those days was in the centre of the city at Suffolk Lane. We don't know where he was educated before, but we do know that afterwards he went up to St John's College, Cambridge, and took an MB in medicine at that institution. And the library is just as he would have seen it, and the outside is just as he would have seen it in 1733. Things haven't moved on in Cambridge. These are the most up-to-date books they have. As a postgraduate, he did the European tour, as did many doctors in those days. And he went to Leiden in Holland, and he went to Reims, where he took an MD. I tried to find some information about his MD, to find that in 1789 the Republic closed down the university, and that was the end of Reims Medical School until the early 60s, so there's no data. Both nice walled cities, as you'll see. In Leiden, he studied under Herman Boerhaave, who was the most eminent physician probably in Europe. And Burton had an immense respect for Boerhaave. He was known as the founder of clinical teaching, and he put together signs and clinical symptoms, and had a very much a Enlightenment view on medicine, and questioned what had gone before, and questioned the case. His reputation was such that the crown heads of Europe used to send their best pupils to him, and he was not only an indefatigable teacher, but he was an affectionate guardian. And you will see his house in which he lived. It was a nice little house on a lake just outside Leiden. It was used in a recent TV series for detectives in Belgium. It was on TV. The baddies lived there. Burton came back to England and initially practiced near Wakefield at Heath, near the home of his grandfather. And in 1735, in York Minster, he married Mary Henson of St Delpike parish. And whether she was living there as a kind of an accommodation address, I'm not sure, but her family came from West Yorkshire. And Burton and his wife moved to York in 1737. The literature describes him as having a bad year in 1743 because both his father and his wife's mother died in that year. On the other hand, he did inherit his father's estates, and his wife was an heiress, and she got the estate of her mother in 1743, so it wasn't such a bad year for the Burtons. It might have been bad for the parents. He was politically active. He took a very active part in the elections of 1734 and 1741. He came from Wakefield with a bunch of voters to vote in York, and manned one of the voting booths, and following the election of Stapleton, who was the Tory candidate, there were riots, and Wynne, who was the losing candidate, claimed that these people should be locked up, and indeed they were, and Burton arranged for their bail and their subsequent release. He espoused liberty of parliament, freedom of elections, and prohibition of all influence, and corrupt electoral practice. But there was electoral skullduggery in those days, and voters were paid £1 to vote for the right candidate, and it is said that Burton traded medical care for votes. How things have changed. The city of York at the time was predominantly Tory. The Minster, which was like a walled community within the city, was very much Whig. And amongst the Whigs, the most prominent and vocal was Jack Stern, who was the presenter of the Minster, and he was the uncle of Lawrence Stern. He founded his own newspaper briefly, and very few copies survive, and he was so argumentative he even fell out with his own nephew. Now here we see two lovely plates of Hogarth's The Election, one of the initial hustings at an inn where the two candidates are being courted by their constituents outside the window, because this is a Whig husting. You can see that from the orange flag. The Conservatives are outside, the Tories are outside the window. And on the election day, as you can see, the one-legged man and the guy that's virtually dead is being taken to vote, and it's all exceedingly corrupt. On the left of the picture is the George Inn, York, which was in Coney Street, one of the coaching inns of York, and that was the hotbed of the Whigs in York. And opposite was the Black Swan, from which the stagecoach drove to London in 4 days. Made Virgin look positively good. And to all points around the county. In York, Burton met others in the medical community, one of which was Francis Drake. Francis Drake had been appointed in about 1727 to the post of surgeon to the city. He was apprenticed to a York surgeon. When he was 21, the surgeon died, creating an entire practice which Drake took over. And he was an interested antiquarian, and he published his monumental works in 2 volumes, The History and Antiquities of the City of York, which was probably the first book about any city in this country, showing its antiquities and environment. And the plates in that book are universally famous. And here we see the beautiful bridge, which was Ouse Bridge, which the corporation happily took down and replaced with a metal structure, which is probably much better, but in terms of tourism, if we had that, we would rival Florence. The river was a little bit wider in those days by the look of that fantastic view, and the ships that were sailing up it were truly galleons. Burton moved into the Red House. He rented it via a second party from the corporation. As he wasn't a freeman, he couldn't take the lease on himself in his own name. And as you can see, doctors in those days lived the life, didn't they? Nice houses. One of the other physicians in York, which was Clifton Wintringham, had what is now the Judge's Lodgings as his house, equally a nice little house. Burton was pretty soon into medical publication, and in his life he wrote a number of treatises, his first being an account of a monstrous child. We've all written about those. The non-naturals, and later on was his magnum opus in 1751. His first paper was quite short. Things are different in those days. You actually anonymised it by missing out the first name of the patient. At the end you say, well, you know, if you don't believe this, I can bring many certificates as well as living witnesses, just in case you need a bit of, you know, corroboration. It's clearly a case of ectopia vesicae, but he didn't call it in those days. And it's interesting to see that the child lived to the age of 5, but died of smallpox rather than of renal failure. His book, The Non-Naturals, which he alluded to as air, meat and drink, exercise, sleep and wakening, things that are attained that should be excreted, and those that actually are excreted but which should be retained, and afflictions of the mind. It's quite a significant tome. I tried going through it, but in it he affects the effect of climate and diet on the body and promotes clean and pure water, which was pretty radical in those days. The fact that he had shares in York Water might call into question some of his morals. And there was the most sycophantic dedication to Burhave at the beginning. In my readings, I've come across one of his prescriptions, which was written soon after he came to York, and I don't really want you to read it at great length, for those that can, but just know that he's been accused of actually being a bit of a charlatan because he used the fine filings of a pewter spoon in his medicine, and that's the bit that everyone seems to have focused on without looking at the 3 lines above, and the fact that it was drunk in water that had been boiled with 2 ounces of mercury in it, down to from 3 quarts down to 2 quarts. But something of his character does come through, because he said, "I shall be glad to hear how it agrees with the patient, and let me know, and I will be very willing to do my best to save any person, especially the poor and the helpless," which says something about the character of the man that comes out a little later. And then he produces a bit of venom at the end, and they send the enclosures represent service to all kind of good wishes to everyone except honest John Liversidge, who I say is a rogue, and please tell him this. So he was quite a man. Now, Bruce Jackson very kindly translated the prescription for me, and you will see that prescription 1 was briny root, black cherry bark, and santonin was a purgative. The second bit was mercury and sulphur ground up together to make a black powder. The powder of crab's eyes, which were crayfish eyes, but who's to know, and more mercury. Up rather than down. And when he sent me the information, I said, I presume you could dispense it, but he told me that crab's eye and briny root were no longer in the natural form. And he'd always despaired of surgeons writing prescriptions. In my perusings, I looked at the local paper for York in 1745, which was the York Courant, and there were 2 adverts in the paper for pills. Dr. Burhar's Golden Medicine came up again, golden for the people that purveyed it, and Dr. Bellicost's pills, which were continued in production until the early 20th century. They were predominantly mercuric preparations, and they were useful for anything. Gout, kidney stones, bladder stones, and also good at poisoning the patient with heavy metals. Said that he was a philanthropist. We saw that in his prescription that he was concerned about the poor, and it was said that he would see the poor at the end of the day, and even go and visit them at home and give his advice for free. He promoted the need for an infirmary in York, and because he was a Tory, it was naturally opposed by the Whigs, but York County Hospital was established in 1740, and he was one of the first 2 physicians in the county hospital. Francis Drake, who we mentioned earlier, was the first honorary surgeon. They had the advantage of the medical staff could mix with the good and the great, which possibly had some benefits to them in a pecuniary fashion. No one under the age of 7 was allowed in, and certainly no one with venereal disease. They didn't separate syphilis and gonorrhea in those days. As I said, Burton met a fellow like mind in Drake in antiquarian matters, and Burton built up a collection of scrolls and parchments, and he gave the city of York in 1743 this rather beautiful document, which is a copy of the Richard I and Henry II rolls to the city. The city didn't have them, and he had the originals, and he offered those to the city as well, as long as they would house them in an appropriate building. And he had between 2,000 and 3,000 of these statutes that he had collected. They thanked him very much, and said, thanks but no thanks, but we'll take the copy. And this used to hang in the mansion house until a time that no one can remember. And I went along and asked if it was still there, and they found it and produced it. It's between two sheets of cardboard, not on display, but it is absolutely beautiful. And along the bottom you can see blown up there that it was given by Thomas Place and Dr. John Burton. Well, all was plain sailing on the Ouse, but if you look on the right of the building, on the top left picture, and if you look here, you can see what is York Castle and Prison. And whilst everyone was dancing in the new assembly rooms, Prince Charles Stuart landed in Scotland and at Glenfinnan raised his banner and proclaimed his father, James III of England and James VIII of Scotland, 7th, 8th, and started to march south. Archbishop Herring, who is that beautiful painting in the bottom left, painted by Hogarth, preached a sermon about the rights of the Hanoverian dynasty and then had a big meeting in the castle where they raised £30,000 on the night to fund a militia, a lot of money. Burton was in attendance, as was Drake, but was one of the few of the good and great in York who did not fund the militia. Drake was a non-juror, refused to swear an oath of loyalty to the Crown, and he and fellow non-jurors and all Catholics were therefore banned from leaving the confines of York and going more than 5 miles from the city. Now, Burton had estates, as we know, in West Yorkshire, and on Michaelmas, which was early November, they were due, and he asked the mayor and the recorder of York if he might leave and go across quickly and collect the money before Bonnie Prince Charlie came south and took the lot. And so on the 23rd of November, he left the city and went just west of Settle, where his estates were. When he got there, he found that his workers had actually all disappeared up to Kendal to have a gawp at the young pretender as he came southwards. So he went and had his hair cut near Hornby Castle in a local inn, and sent a letter to the Duke of Perth, who he knew was staying there, to say, I'm here, but could I have a free passage because I'm a good guy and I'm a doctor. Unfortunately, the Duke of Perth wasn't there, and Lord Elcho with some Highlanders came down and allegedly arrested Mr. Burton, Dr. Burton. He was taken to Lancaster on his horse. He was seen riding with the rebels. He met Bonnie Prince Charlie, and is clearly documented and questioned by him, and then given a note of parole and left via Settle, having first collected his rent. Now, all this seems to us very innocent. Didn't quite seem so innocent to Dr. Stern in York. And on his return to York, he's declared a suspicious person and put into prison in the new prison. And then, with some ferreting around, they found one of the prisoners, Mr. James Nesbitt, who was already a prisoner himself, who was prepared to bear witness against Burton to say that he'd drunk oaths in favour of the Pretender and against the king. And so he was put into a more severe form of incarceration, not allowed pen, paper or visits. In his own book he says he wasn't allowed intercourse with anyone, which was interesting. When evidence was being collected, he was sent down to London by King's messenger. And at the time he had severe gout, which was to affect him for most of his life, but he went down to London, and it took a week to get to London. Now, various bits of information came out, one being from John Broughton, who was the secretary to Charles Stuart, and it said that he recollected Dr. Burton meeting the prince, and when he was asked if there were many people in York, he said there were many persons there who would have joined him if he had come via York. The evidence, however, was very circumstantial, and in spite of the day's Georgian jurists were exceptionally honest and insisted that, you know, if we were going to get evidence, it had to be absolutely down the line. And whilst some thought that this was enough to hang him, he festered in prison. Amongst fellow prisoners were Flora MacDonald and James Murray. He was subjected to a major examination at the cockpit, which was in the old Westminster Palace, by Andrew Stone, who was principal secretary to Lord Newcastle, who was the first Secretary of State. And there's a lovely document extolling exactly the interrogation, and in it Burton is economical with the truth, and there is nothing that is particularly condemns him. Anyway, he was kept in prison in London until the spring of 1747, when after almost a year, and he was sent back to York on bail. During the time that he was in London, a big event took place on the Knavesmire, which was the hanging of 14 of the prisoners from York, who had been tried and condemned to death. They were hanged slowly. I'm not sure how you would hang somebody quickly, but they were hung slowly for 10 minutes, and then stripped, and their hearts were cut out, and the hangman held up the heart and said, "Gentlemen, behold the heart of a traitor!" And there were lots of loud huzzas. And the whole thing, according to the London Post, was conducted with the most utter decency and good order.
Good idea.
And the heads of William Connolly and James Mayne were placed on spikes on Micklegate Bar to deter the others, and the third head was sent across to Carlisle. Burton was released without trial, effectively impoverished between estimates of £2,000 and £5,000, effectively bankrupt, and allegedly paid 10 shillings in the pound to his creditors and had to rely on the income of his wife. They were forced to sell the lease to the Red House and move to Micklegate. And as I said, Kell hardship, because Micklegate was the very fashionable centre of York in those days, and you've only got to go up and see the lovely Georgian houses up Micklegate to realise that this was the royal processional route into the city. Flora MacDonald and James Murray called on him on the way home to Scotland and visited him again in York, and he maintained an interesting correspondence with Scotland, which, looking 200 years later, was probably enough to hang him. But he was rehabilitated and became a commissioner for land tax in 1750, and this honour was repeated on 2 other occasions. It appears that his time was used sensitively in London, because he had direct access to Flora MacDonald, and it's thought that he is the author of the escape of the young Chevalier by an Englishman, which was an account from the eyewitnesses of the escape of Bonnie Prince Charlie from the English. And this book remains in print today. He subsequently published an impassioned book, British Liberty Endangered, extolling why he'd been a better friend than anyone else to the British Constitution, and dedicated to the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, who was the former Archbishop of York, Archbishop Herring. And in it we've got a first-hand account of all his troubles and tribulations. And as historians have said, it's probably one of the few first-hand accounts. Now, whether there's an element of bias in it is anyone's guess. Moving on, at the time of the mid-18th century, and from the late 17th century, the standard textbook for diseases of women was a book called Diseases of Women by Morisot. And those with brains that are half in gear will remember Morisot from the Morisot Smelly Vite manoeuvre for delivering breeches. It was translated by Hugh Chamberlain. Anyway, cutting to 1750, Burton was informed that somebody else was about to publish a textbook on midwifery, and so he got in first with his own, which was called An Essay Towards a Complete New System of Midwifery. Dedicated in his typical fashion to the present members of the Royal Society, with a particularly eulogistic forward. But in it he made a number of observations which were unique and original. That the maternal and fetal circulation are separate. That purple fever is contagious. A century before Semmelweis. That the liquor was there as a protective environment for the fetus, and the volume was gestation dependent. Talked of the benefit of the left lateral position for delivery, and caesarean section for the benefit of the baby, because if the mother and baby don't have the same circulation, one may be saved after the death of another. And I've copied out a little bit of the book. Here we see there is so great a disproportionate size of the human uterine sinuses and their excretory channels to the very small extreme umbilical vessels, there can be no anastomosis. Basically saying they're separate. He also produced diagrams of his uterine forceps, which are pretty horrendous, and they're very similar to the ones on the right, which were Palfrey's forceps, which had been first published in 1720. So they were basically built on an earlier model. The illustrations in his book are absolutely beautiful. Very tiny little volume, but beautiful illustrations. And there's a footling breech and a flex breech, and some pretty unusual lies. And he does admit that some of them are taken from post-mortem cases. Beautiful illustrations, aren't they? And that's because they were done by George Stubbs. And George Stubbs, the artist now generally remembered as a painter of horses, in 1745 to 1750 studied and taught anatomy at York County Hospital. And he was taught by Dr. Atkinson Senior, or later. Anyway, the man that he was trying to pip to the post was Smellie, born in Lanarkshire and educated at Glasgow University, studies in France, and he opened up for business in London in 1739. This is a course there in the offers of lectures, and a pair of his original forceps. He was an intensive teacher, and he published his own textbook, Theory and Practice of Midwifery, and he was an innovative man midwife and one of the first to recommend a pelvic curve for forceps as well as the cephalic curve, and initially promoted wooden forceps. Now, Burton, never a man to keep his opinions to himself, decided to read the book and then derided Smelly's lack of erudition. Partly because Smelly went through the history of the greats and good in medicine before going into his diatribe on of midwifery, and mentioned one of the greats of general medical history as Lythopedon senalis, which was basically a calcified fetus. And Burton took him to task over this. He also took him to task over the fact that Smelly thought of bleeding for edema, bleeding for hemorrhage. If somebody's bleeding, nothing like letting another pint of blood out their arm takes their mind off the hemorrhage. Smelly was using leather handles on his forceps, which Burton thought were a bit unhygienic and could lead to infection. He thought raw steel was much better. And hot baths for, I can't remember what it's for actually, but he was hot baths for one of the conditions. I won't give you this, but this is just telling you about why he thought that it was bad to consider hemorrhage for edema. So Burton was one of the first exponents of peer review. His letter to Smelly, which was published, ran to 260 pages. And he was not the first to castigate Smelly. And clearly the book, as we will see, was not only read by physicians but by the general public. William Douglas castigated Smelly for degrading the profession by teaching midwifery at a very low price. I mean, of course, we'd all agree with that. And giving certificates to people who'd only attended a few weeks of the course, framed and hung up in conspicuous parts of their houses, and surveyed with veneration by the patients. Now, we've all been to courses where we've got certificates, so now it's part of your CME folder. Things moved on. On the left you will see a piquet-knobbed stick from the 17th century, and those who are members of the Society will know that we have in our collection a piquet ivory handled stick that was stolen about 2 years ago and recovered, and is valued at about £15,000, and is in fact in the case out in the corridor. It's a wonderful piece of art, but it went out of fashion, and it was standard practice for prominent physicians to have gold-topped canes to show basically their profession, rather than having a stethoscope around your neck in those days, because of course the stethoscope hadn't been invented. You had a gold-topped walking stick which you swaggered around town, and everyone knew that you were an eminent physician. Take note, all eminent physicians in the room. Anyway, at the Sheriff Jopp's party, Mr. George Thompson sent a little note up the table proposing a toast, and this was read out, and the entire assembly, except the mayor and the alderman, stood for the toast, and it was to William III, long dead, but to William III, and Burton refused to stand for this toast, and got into quite a strop with Mr. Thompson, and then Thompson said, well, if you won't drink to William III, at least you'll drink damnation to the Pretender and all his family. And Burton said, I won't drink damnation to anyone, be it the Pretender or anyone else. And then he hit Thompson with his stick, and there turned quite a major fracas in the room, and it led to a legal hearing. Now, as I said, Burton's book was read by many, and his letter to Smellie, that is, and at the time in York was Lawrence Sterne. He was vicar of Sutton-on-Forest, and latterly Stillington and Coxwold. He was educated at Halifax, one of the schools there, and then subsequently St John's, Cambridge, just after Burton, and had some very doubtful friends, one of them being John Hall Stevenson, who was at St John's with him, who was a bit of a hellraiser, and had a group called the Demoniacs, including Robert Lascelles of Harewood, and they got up to all sorts of mischief, and Sterne was on the edge of it. In 1759, he published his first of volumes of what was to be 9 of his book on Tristan Shandy, the most impenetrable book, sadly, that I've ever tried to read, and I have failed over and over again to read it, and I take my hat off to anyone that's finished it. But it apparently is incredibly funny if you can read it. It's a biography of the titular character, and in it he introduces a man midwife called Dr. Slop in chapter 34, which is largely or uniquely based on Burton. Described as a squat, uncourtly figure about 4.5 feet perpendicular, with a big belly, and he might have done honour to a sergeant in the Horse Guards. And you will see on the left Dr. Slop sitting asleep whilst Parson Yorick extols to the rest of the group, and you see him a little fat man, and that was done by Hogarth. So if you're going to get your book published, at least get Hogarth to do the frontispiece. A bit like Burton getting Stubbs to do his work. Slop is portrayed as an incompetent quack who turns up without his viol instruments, and they have to be sent for. And in performing a forceps delivery, he manages to break the baby's nose, which he then repairs with a cotton thread and a piece of whalebone, as you do. Certainly Sue Mitchell never did that, as far as I know. Was he a 4'6" dwarf? The evidence is that, in fact, Burton was a tall, well-cut figure, but he was known in and around York as Slop, according to Dr. Belcombe, and Dr. Belcombe is the man there, so he must know. Philip Mercier, who was the great artist in York, painted a picture of the Charles Stewart that we saw, painted the picture of Francis Drake, painted many pictures of unknown men, and these are just two, and you just wonder whether Burton is one of those. We don't know what he looked like, there's no remain. He was heavily into antiquarian publications, and he published a major book in 1759 called the Monasticon Eberensine, which was a history of Yorkshire, which is an enormous tome of great erudition, and it is, again, impenetrable. There is a copy in the York Minster Library, and at the end he said that it would be a good idea to have a society for compiling a history of Yorkshire, and from that became the idea of the York Philosophical Society many years later. He was elected to be a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, but never FRS, as is sometimes said, and his book, as you would imagine, was dedicated to the President and Fellows, and it goes on for quite a frontispiece. He was beginning to get old, ill, and he was clearly looking for some money, and so he sold his collection, including the early part of the second volume of his monastic studies, to William Constable, who was an avaricious collector of curios at Burton Constable Hall. The papers were legion, and at the late 19th century they were sold off at Sotheby's along with the rest of the collection of Constable's effects. He died intestate. There's a declaration of his son of his worth, which is not very much, and his wife died shortly after in 1771. His son is said to have been an army officer, but I can find nothing about it in the army lists. And in the January edition of the York Courant, there's a little note, and it's on microfilm, and it's impossible to read, but it said, last Saturday, died at his house in the city, Dr. John Burton, MD and FAS, gentleman, and I think it says much missed by his acquaintances. He's buried in Holy Trinity, York, and there is a lovely monument which is a scroll with the seal at the bottom, 2 books to signify the published and the unpublished volume of his major antiquarian work, and it's all in all a lovely monument to him as a physician. And to conclude, I would just like to bring to your attention James Atkinson, who was a surgeon in York for many years, and he was obviously as well a bibliographer, and he compiled a large bibliography of important people. And he said about Burton, Burton, within my recollection, resided at York. He had a domestic monkey, on whom my father wished my brother and me to call and leave a card. Monsieur de Monkey, however, was at home. We were desired to walk in. Upon our interview, he leapt upon my head, where he played all the monkey tricks imaginable. Can you wonder that I should relate this anecdote? Remember Dr. Burton or his monkey? In it also he says that Burton was a considerable practitioner in obstetric practice, as he was told by his father, and at the very bottom he mentions the fact that his father, Atkinson Senior, had taught Stubbs all the anatomy he ever needed to know at York. What have we got left of Burton? Well, we have John Burton's forceps, and for those of you that know the case, these are they. Can we have the lights up? They've been passed down from successive generations, and they eventually came to the York Medical Society. So these are not the forceps in the book, but are a later version. They're called lobster claw forceps, and they look horrific. There's also a pair of 18th century forceps in our collection, which have good old leather handles, which must be, wouldn't be Burton's, because he would have thought that they were the devil's instruments because of the infection risk. Well, may you all live in interesting times. I think you can say that Burton certainly came to the attention of those in authority. He certainly came to the attention of those powerful people of the day, and you, the important people, know about him as well. So, thank you. In our collection, we have a monkey, and I was just wondering whether this is Burton's monkey. It's certainly old. Long ago did he turn up his toes. And he's well preserved. He's been varnished. Could be. Don't know. But it'd be a nice end to the story if this was Burton's monkey. We also have and a leg. But,